My Mother, the Person and the Patient is an original podcast written and hosted by me, Fortuna Kuso. This podcast is about my mother, Timira Abdussamid Mohammed, Ayaya we call her, and that's the Somali word for grandmother, and her great-grandchildren call her Ayaya too, and that is their way of saying great-grandmother. As you might know, if you have listened to any of the other episodes, I have been a caregiver to my mother for the last 12 years. And before that, I raised 5 children. And when my children were growing up, I always had these plans of things that I wanted to do when the children were older, children had their own jobs, when the children were self-sufficient, when they didn't need me physically, financially, and on and on. And then as I was at the tail end of raising my children, my mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So my youngest finished high school and went to university 2015, and my mother was diagnosed 2011. So my mother's need of care was just beginning to grow complex when my youngest one went away for university. And when she finished 5 years later, I am still in the thick of it. So I finished raising the children as far as them being self-sufficient financially, physically, being able to afford their own things came. Then I am now a caregiver to my mother. So when I was raising the children, my story was, I am going to do this and this and this when the children were older. And then that transformed into me saying, I will do this and this and this after I am done being a caregiver to my mother. But for the last few months, it just dawned on me, I can't really say I am going to do this after I'm done with being a caregiver to my mother, because there is no way to know when I will be done being a caregiver to my mother. Because 2 things I'm certain. Number one, I love and I get joy of being a caregiver to my mother. And the second thing is, I will not do it in any other way, including putting her in a nursing home or having somebody else take her. Those 2 things I'm very certain. Within that, then I have to carve myself a space where I could do the things I would like to do, having a plan of places that I wanted to visit and to see in the world, and working and saving money so I have somebody to stay with my mother for a week or 2 when I do things. I have to find a way to be a caregiver to my mother and take care of her, because that's very important to me. It's not something that I'm mandated. It's not something that somebody else is making me do. But at the same time, I have to find a way to do things outside being a caregiver that I would like to do. So if you are at the beginning of your caregiving, like your loved one is just being diagnosed, or they're still with it, but not really, and you could see where this is headed, please make sure that you are carving yourself a space within that title of being a caregiver. Find the things that you can do that is only you, that's not relying on you being a caregiver. Things that you could do for yourself. That's why I am doing other things like speaking in events, connecting with a larger community, and helping out people learn from my experience. That's something I really love, and I'm working toward that. Now it's time for me to change the focus, to focus on something else, something different, something that really I am passionate about. And I'm taking small steps. It's not like I can jump and travel tomorrow. It's going to take me time, but I have that realization now. I am working towards and taking small steps, and that has made all the difference. When you listen to how we arrived at my mother's diagnosis and what followed, it's so easy to see her just as the patient, to see her as nothing more than the disease that reduced her to shell of her old self. But I want to also to tell you about my mother, the person, the fierce woman that told her stories unapologetically, celebrating the beautiful parts and harsh realities equally. I want to share with you the stories she told us about her life as a girl growing up in a small village, the tales that marked her adulthood. I want to share with you all her losses and the ultimate winnings. The following chapter is one of those stories, reconstructed from my childhood memory. As she lifted her hand to reach for Layla, Timira had only two things on her mind: not to get scratched on the face and to inflict an injury that would require medical treatment on Layla. When Timira grabbed a handful of her hair, Layla's entire focus was trying to keep her balance and stay upright. The liquid soap on the cement floor pulled her legs out from under her, and Layla landed on the floor like a log, and Timira was on top of her in an instant. The fight raged. Timira and Layla became a tumultuous tangle of limbs and fury, their bodies slipping and sliding on the soapy floor, struggling for dominance. The flickering fluorescent light above cast eerie shadows, magnifying how Timira had the upper hand. As Timira pounded her fist on every part of her body, Layla's once sleek hair now hung loose, cascading around her face like a wild, dark halo, strands matted with soap suds and sweat. Timira's eyes blazed with a fierce determination, betraying her inner joy. Layla's hands flared to reach for Timira without success. Lips sealed into a thin line, her brows knitted together in a fierce scowl, Timira pinned Layla, rendering her completely powerless. Timira stayed focused and her hands clawed and grappled for purchase, fingers digging into flesh and fabric alike, leaving red welts and torn fabric in their wake. The scent of her exertion mingled with the acrid tang of cleaning chemicals, forming a bitter, suffocating atmosphere that clung to her clothes and highlighted the victory before her. As they rolled, their movements echoed off the rigid walls, punctuated by Timira's gasps, effort to maintain control over Layla. The slippery surface beneath them heightened the chaos, making their struggle more frantic and uncontrolled. With every lunge, Layla slipped and slid under Timira, her body crashing. Each impact must have sent shock waves of pain through Layla's bones, for Timira heard the woman grunt after each punch. She rejoiced. Amidst the joy of hearing Layla wail with pain, Timira felt a sudden surge of guilt. The high-pitched cries of the children drilled into her consciousness, a sharp reminder of the unintended consequences of her actions. She chose this a day her husband was off duty so he could mind her children, but she had failed to consider the innocent bystanders. Too consumed by her need for retribution, Timira didn't think about all the children that are arriving at the communal showers for their evening wash at that very moment. The image of her husband at home, tending to her children, momentarily pierced through her rage, causing a flicker of remorse to ripple through her heart. A distant sound cut through the thunder of her guilt, jarring her concentration. Timira. It was a voice unmistakably her husband's, calling out her name. She paused for a single second, longer than she should have in the battle of her life. "What are you doing?" he asked. "He's not supposed to be here," Timira thought to herself, a furrow deepening between her brows. "I left him with the children." Why had Muhammad left the house and ventured into the shower area? As she hesitated, A mixture of concern and annoyance gripped her. A second voice joined the chorus. It was a neighbor, Mustafa, who had come to help, lured by the sound of the commotion. Timiro, stop, stop, Mustafa called out. He tried to unfasten her grip on Layla's hair. Layla wasn't fighting back anymore, but Timiro didn't want to let go. She wanted all to see her victory. The more witnesses, the better. Mustafa let go of Timiro's hands and stepped away from where she lay on top of Layla. I need help, Mustafa yelled. Please call the others. Soon Timiro heard boots coming her way, but she didn't move. By the time Mustafa and another man lifted Timiro off Layla, she was filled with so much joy. Look at her ear, one of the men said. But her husband wasn't among them. Where did he go? She's badly hurt. She's bleeding, Timur heard Mustafa say. I lost an earring, Layla yelled, as if that was the most important thing at the time. You will worry about that later, Mustafa comforted Layla. We need to get you to the clinic, Mustafa said. But you must stay still. They're bringing the stretcher. He waited for a minute. Can you move your arms? Your legs? Layla said nothing. The sun descended, casting a warm, golden hue over the sprawling military base when Timira was led out of the communal showers and toward the holding cell. The breeze was gentle, carrying the earthly scent of freshly turned soil. She kept her head down, replaying the event that preceded this week. The snapshots that flashed in her mind made her happy. She took a stand and everyone knew it. She spat blood onto her hand and smiled at the sight of one of Layla's gold earrings. Two men walked on either side of her until they reached the place in the back of the base. Timira had never seen this place before, but only heard about it. She knew it was the facility where they kept soldiers who abandoned their duties. As far as she knew, she was the first wife to end up in one of those cells. The officer leading her opened a door. The holding cell was stark and bare. Its walls were painted a dull, lifeless shade of gray that seemed to suck all warmth and vitality from the room. A single narrow window, high up near the ceiling, let in a sliver of a pale moonlight, casting faint shadows that danced along the walls. Timira huddled on the cold cement bench, her torn clothes offering little protection against the chill that seeped into her to shake the weight of her actions. She shivered, wrapping her arms tightly around her chest, seeking protection from the harsh reality that enveloped her now. Along with the overwhelming awareness of the chaos she'd unleashed, Timira felt victorious. The fluorescent light above flickered intermittently, casting a harsh, clinical glow that only intensified the sense of isolation. In that lonely cell, surrounded by cold walls, Timira thought about her children and her husband. She'd heard him call her name once, but didn't know how long he'd stayed there. Did he have the children with him? She asked aloud. She hoped they hadn't seen her like that, viciously attacking another woman. But it was not like she had other options. They can't expect her to endure mistreatment. Her thoughts were interrupted by footsteps approaching the heavy metal door. Her heart leapt to her chest, hopeful that it might be someone coming to offer her solace or reassurance. To her joy, it was Muhammad, his silhouette casting a long shadow across the cell wall. He stood before her. Timira dared not meet his gaze. Unable to bear the weight of disappointment and betrayal she knew she would find in his eyes. How are you, Muhammad asked. I am okay. She was feeling the best she'd felt since the day Layla began the chore schedule. But Timira wanted to apologize to her husband, not because she attacked Layla. That needed to happen. But the fact that her husband came upon her filled her with remorse. The lack of forethought bothered her. Still, she couldn't say sorry without bracing the phrase in context that showed what it was she was sorry for. And there was no time to delve into the details. The officer who escorted her husband stood close and glanced at his wristwatch as if counting the minutes. "How are the children?" she asked instead. "They miss you." Mohammed handed her a cloth bag. "I brought you some food," he said. "I didn't have enough time to make tea." His voice barely a whisper. Timira nodded wordlessly, unable to summon language to respond. After all she'd done, he was worried about her not having her evening cup of tea. His kindness awed her. "I have to return home to the children." His tone was heavy, as if exhausted, even though that was his day off work. "I'll get you out of here as soon as possible." The questions Timira had expected, the why, the how, and what did she do, didn't graze her husband's lips. He didn't seem angry at her. No sign of embarrassment over her actions appeared upon his face. "May Allah be with you," he said, turned around and walked away. She watched him, his figure receding into the darkness beyond the doorway. The officer that came with him followed him out the door. Oppressive silence followed her husband's departure, only broken by the distant echoes of muffled voices and occasional metallic clang of a door being shut. It was 2 days from the epic fight that Timira was released from the holding cell. Layla's family and tribal elder agreed to wait for 7 days for you to come up with the restitution. The officer sitting across from Timira and Muhammad in the tiny office wasn't speaking to her. Every word was directed at her husband, as if he were the one that caused the injury to the woman. "The tribes must agree on how much and who pays." Timira hated that. She had been before tribal meetings twice already. Now her father and his elder had to be dispatched to deal with another of her mishaps. And for Muhammad to bring his elder into this when he didn't even invite him to be part of their marriage negotiations would be almost impossible. At the time of their wedding, Muhammad told her that since his father died when he was a young boy, he didn't realize he needed to pay his family's dues to the tribe until he was much older. So the elders held a grudge. "Sign here." The officer pushed the paper over to Muhammad and placed the pen over it. "If the issue is not solved within that time, your wife will have to come here and face the law." Somehow or another, Muhammad was able to convince his tribal elder to help. Timur listened as he told his elder he'd been paying his dues for over 20 years now, and didn't even come to them to pay for the wedding. 3 days after she was released, the elders from both sides held a meeting. Like the other 2 times, she was in the middle of an unpleasant meeting where people discussed about her as if she wasn't there. Timira felt a lump rise in her throat as she listened to the tense exchange between the elders and her husband. "She is my wife," her husband said, as if the people before him didn't know that, "the mother of my children." "Exactly," the elder from her village waved her father quiet. "That's why it's your tribe's responsibility to pay for this." Timira looked at her husband. The worry lines etched deep into his weathered face. The man whose strength had been a pillar for her now stood vulnerable, turning from one elder to another, neither of the 2 elders relenting. "I have 2 small children." Her husband stood up and walked toward his elder. "You know I have no mother, no father, not even a sister." Muhammad stopped, took a deep, silent breath, And I paid my share every time you contacted me for the last 20 years. I paid every penny of it. Timira watched the elder from her village to turn to her father. They spoke in whispers, just like the other elder and the two men that came with him exchanged quiet words. Muhammad's unwavering declaration cut through the silence like a blade. She is my wife, he repeated, my responsibility, and that makes it your responsibility. His voice resonated with a resolve that surprised even Timiro. He stood less than 4 feet away from his elder, unwavering in his commitment to his family, unwilling to let his wife bear the consequences alone. The room felt silent, each elder seemingly contemplating the decision's gravity. The weight of the silence seemed to compress the very air in the room, leaving an almost palpable tension that hung between the elders. Timira's gaze remained fixed on her husband, her heart swelling with an overwhelming surge of gratitude. Despite the weight of the situation, she found solace in his unwavering support. The elders changed guarded glances. Their expression is softened by Muhammad's steadfast stance. It was as if his words had shifted the dynamics in the room, nudging the elders to reconsider their position. Timira could almost feel the weight of the decision hovering in the air. The fate of her freedom rested on this crucial moment. After what felt like an eternity, the elder from Timira's tribe spoke, his voice laced with a solemn tone. We will pay for half the restitution, he said, his gaze meeting Muhammad's with a mixture of respect and understanding. But you must agree to pay the other half. He addressed Muhammad's elder with that last part. Timira's breath caught in her throat as she absorbed the elder's words, a glimmer of hope igniting within her. As the minutes stretched into an eternity, the elder from Muhammad's tribe finally broke the silence. His voice steady. We will pay the other half, he announced, conveying the finality of the decision. We want to restore this family together. As the elders began to disperse, the weight of the room lightened, the burden of the moment lifting from Timira's shoulders. Relief washed over her. My Mother, the Person and the Patient can be found in Amazon Music, Apple Podcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please remember to follow, like, and share, and join me next week as I share with you another episode of my mother's journey as both the person and the patient. Thank you.